March 23, 1945, dawned cold and grey over Camp Rustin, Louisiana. The day seemed to hold its breath as the hum of transport trucks filled the air. They were rolling through the gates, not carrying the usual cargo of ordinary prisoners of war, but an unusual and significant group, 32 German women. Each of them had played various roles in the Third Reich's apparatus, but none more so than the wives, sisters and daughters of SS officers, nurses and administrative workers. These were not mere soldiers. These were women who had once held power, who had once believed in the supremacy of their cause. Their faces, still holding on to the remnants of Aryan pride, gazed with scornful contempt at the young American soldiers who stood watching them. These were the women who had seen their world crumble, but who still clung to the ideology they had been taught. The war was over for everyone else, but for them, the battle for their beliefs was just beginning. Among the first to disembark was Margaret Hoffman, a woman whose presence seemed to command the attention of the others. She was tall, her back straight, betraying no sign of the hardship she had faced during her journey. At 43 years old, Hoffman had spent the last decade as the head of a communications unit in Berlin, absorbing the warped propaganda that had come to define her worldview. She looked at the American soldiers, some barely in their 20s, and sneered. To her, these men were soft. They lacked the discipline she had seen in her own soldiers, and she was not shy about letting her contempt be known. "Look at them," she whispered to the woman beside her, a nurse named Helga Schneider. "Our men were warriors, not these. Children." Hoffman's voice carried through the group like a ripple, and soon others joined in. They were women of discipline, used to a world where order was absolute and men held unquestioned power. Now, they were in the hands of the enemy, but they would not go easily. They would resist with their minds, with their words, and with their sense of superiority. To them, the American victory was an anomaly, a product of overwhelming numbers of sheer brute force, and not of any inherent weakness in the German cause. "They move like farmers going to milk cows," Helga Schneider added, her voice thick with disdain. "How did we lose to these?" But the Americans were not without their own thoughts. Captain Robert Mitchell, the camp's executive officer, watched the women with a mixture of curiosity and weariness. As a veteran of the North African campaign and Normandy, Mitchell had seen many German prisoners. But these women were different. Their defiance was unlike anything he had encountered before. They were not the broken soldiers who had surrendered in droves, exhausted by the years of war. These women still believed. "They're forming hierarchies," Lieutenant Sarah Morrison remarked to Captain Mitchell as they watched Hoffman issue silent orders to the others, her eyes cold and calculating. "That tall one, Hoffman. She's giving orders just with her gaze." Mitchell nodded, knowing this would not be an easy captivity. These women were not defeated in spirit. They were not broken. They were proud, stubborn, and defiant. The camp's facilities had been hastily modified to accommodate them. A section of the sprawling complex that had previously housed thousands of male prisoners was now home to these 32 women. They were kept separate from the men, placed in barracks that, while modest, were comfortable compared to the squalid conditions many POWs endured. It would have been easy to believe the women would be pleased with such accommodations. Instead, the comfort offended them. To them, this was a humiliation, an indignity. They had been told they were superior, that they were the backbone of the Reich, the very embodiment of strength and honor. And now, here they were, in a foreign land, prisoners to the very people they had been taught to despise. Each morning, Hoffman would organize the women into formations, marching them through calisthenics, her every move a reminder that they were still soldiers in their hearts. Her determination was evident, a rigid attempt to assert their superiority in the face of their captivity. It was a small act of defiance, but a significant one. The American soldiers observed with a mixture of amusement and irritation. Some found it laughable that these women, who had been part of the machine that brought so much death and destruction, still carried themselves as if they had never lost. But for others, it was harder to swallow. Sergeant James Crawford, a 24-year-old soldier from Tennessee, had been wounded at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. He had seen too much, lost too much, to take kindly to this mocking display. Yet he was under orders not to engage, not to rise to the provocation. "Look at them." Anna Reichert, a former Luftwaffe communications officer, remarked one day as she peered through the chain-link fence, watching the American soldiers conduct their morning exercises. "Our boys at 16 had more discipline than these men. The taunts became a daily ritual. The women gathered at the fence during the American soldiers' training exercises, pointing and laughing at their perceived weakness. They would mock the soldiers' stumbles, their tiredness, their lack of formality. To the German women, the Americans were a joke, nothing more than children playing at war. But to the soldiers, this mockery stung. They had fought for years, lost friends and comrades, bled and died on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The German women had never seen the horrors they had. As the days passed, the gap between the two sides widened. The German women grew more emboldened, their mockery more frequent. They needed to believe in their superiority, to cling to the world they had once known, to remind themselves that they were still Germans, that they were still warriors. April 1945 brought a surprising warmth to the swamps of Louisiana. The air, thick and heavy, seemed to settle over Camp Rustin like a blanket, but it was a different kind of heat that simmered inside the barracks. It wasn't just the Louisiana sun. It was the tension that had built between the German women prisoners and their American captors. The women had been at Camp Rustin for several weeks now, and their presence had not gone unnoticed. They were not the typical prisoners of war, the tired, broken soldiers who had surrendered in the last days of the Third Reich. These women still believed in the ideals they had fought for, even as the world around them crumbled. Their defiance was palpable, a silent storm that no one had yet figured out how to calm. Margaret Hoffman had emerged as the leader of the group, though she would never formally claim the title. Her authority was unspoken, a quiet command that flowed through the others like an invisible thread. Every morning she gathered the women, organizing them into neat formations, maintaining a rigid schedule that mimicked the military discipline they had all once lived by. It was her way of asserting that they were still soldiers, still German, still superior. Hoffman's determination was evident. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. "We will maintain our dignity," she said one morning during calisthenics. "Even if they try to strip it from us, we will not bend." Her words were met with quiet agreement, a nodding of heads, but no one dared to challenge her leadership. Helga Schneider, the 30-year-old nurse, had served on the Eastern Front, from Stalingrad to Normandy. She had seen the horror of war, but she was unyielding in her belief that the German military had been superior in both discipline and courage. But something had begun to shift inside her. Despite the contempt she still held for the Americans, she began to wonder how their soldiers, young men, who had been trained in basic drills and exercises, could have defeated the mighty Wehrmacht. "I wonder how they won," she muttered one evening, looking out across the camp. "It doesn't make sense. Our men were stronger." Anna Reichert, who had once worked in a Luftwaffe communications center, was among the loudest of the mockers when the German women first arrived at Camp Rustin. She had made it clear that she felt nothing but disdain for the American soldiers, whom she viewed as undisciplined and weak. Yet, like Schneider, there was a crack beginning to form in her beliefs. "Maybe they didn't win with strength," she said one afternoon, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe it wasn't about who had the strongest soldiers." But even as these private doubts began to surface, the defiance from the women remained. They refused to submit, refused to be broken by their captivity. Every opportunity to mock the American soldiers was taken. They stood at the fence during training exercises, calling out insults and sarcastic comments as the soldiers stumbled through obstacle courses. The mockery grew, not just from the women but from the deep-rooted belief that the German soldiers, the Wehrmacht, were superior. To them, this war was not just about winning or losing, it was about proving the world wrong, proving that they were right all along. One morning, as Sergeant James Crawford, a wounded veteran of Bastogne, limped through his rounds, he heard it. Laughter, sharp and mocking. The German women had gathered at the fence again, watching the soldiers as they struggled through their exercises. "Look at them," Helga Schneider called out in heavily accented English. "Our boys at 16 had more discipline than these men." The others laughed, a chorus of derision that made Crawford's stomach tighten. He had fought in the Ardennes, lost friends, seen the hell of war. Yet here he was, being mocked by women who had never felt the weight of battle the way he had. Crawford's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, ignoring the taunts. He had been warned by Captain Mitchell not to engage with the provocations. The women wanted a reaction. They wanted to see if the American soldiers were as weak as they believed. Crawford knew better than to give them that satisfaction. But inside, it hurt. He had lost friends in those forests, fought in the brutal cold of the Bulge, only to be mocked now by women who still clung to their delusions of German superiority. They have to believe it, he told himself. It's all they have left. The days passed, and the cycle of mockery continued. The women would gather, point and laugh at the American soldiers. The young recruits who stumbled through their drills were the prime targets. Their lack of discipline and experience a constant source of ridicule. To the German women, the idea that their captors could defeat the mighty Wehrmacht was unthinkable. Their sense of superiority was the last bastion of their identity, and they would not let it crumble without a fight. Yet even as they mocked, something in the women began to shift. They had been taught that American soldiers were inferior, that they had won by sheer numbers, that their victory was not earned. But the more they watched, the more they began to see something different. The American soldiers may have seemed undisciplined at first glance, but there was something about them. They were resilient. They were tough in a way the German women had never imagined. "They're not like we thought," Anna Reichert admitted to Schneider one evening. "They're not perfect, but they're not as weak as we believed." But this acknowledgement, small as it was not enough to shatter the women's resolve entirely. For every doubt that crept in, there were a dozen reasons to cling to the belief that they were superior, that their cause had been just, that their men were the best soldiers the world had ever seen. They had been trained to believe that, and now, as prisoners of war, it was all they had left. April 1945 had settled in, bringing not only a warmth to the Louisiana swamps, but a growing tension that simmered beneath the surface of Camp Rustin. As the days stretched into weeks, the women prisoners, once the proud members of the Nazi machine, began to interact more directly with their American captors. The camp's mundane routines of processing and confinement now had a sharp undercurrent of psychological warfare. For the women, this was not just captivity, it was a challenge to their beliefs, their pride, and the identity they had held onto for so long. At the heart of this resistance stood Margaret Hoffman, who, despite her position as an unofficial leader, refused to accept the reality of defeat. Every morning, she took command of the other women, organizing them into neat rows, setting schedules, and maintaining a semblance of military discipline. She had come to represent the defiance of the entire group, a stoic figure in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the days went on, however, it became clear that her strict regimen was less about maintaining order and more about maintaining an illusion of control. Hoffman's grip on the women's morale was strong, but it wasn't unshakable. The realization that they were prisoners had set in, but the belief that they were still part of something greater lingered like a stubborn cloud. To them, their captivity was temporary, an inconvenience that would eventually pass. The propaganda they had been fed for so many years told them that they were superior beings, that they were the backbone of the Third Reich, and that defeat was a temporary setback. But every passing day brought them closer to the undeniable truth: their world was gone. The mockery of the American soldiers began as a way to fight against this crushing realization. They needed to hold on to their former strength, their superiority, whatever they had left. And so, with every opportunity, the women gathered at the fence, eyes narrowed, sneers on their faces, and words sharp as knives. They watched the American soldiers with disdain, their every movement a mockery in the eyes of these women who had once believed in the absolute superiority of their own. It started with the soldiers' morning exercises. The recruits, young and inexperienced, stumbled through their drills, their movements uncoordinated and awkward. The German women took every opportunity to point out their flaws. "Look at them," Helga Schneider called out to the others one morning, her voice thick with sarcasm. "They can't even march properly. How did we lose to these?" The others laughed, their voices like the sharp crackle of a whip cutting through the morning air. "Farmers," Anna Reichert chimed in, her accent thick with contempt. "They're all just farmers pretending to be soldiers." The insults came fast and furious, each one more biting than the last. To the German women, this was their only remaining defense, mocking their captors, ridiculing them, and clinging to the idea that their own men, the men they had followed into war, were still superior. Their pride was all they had left, and they would protect it with every ounce of energy they could muster. Sergeant James Crawford, a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, had grown used to the ridicule. He had seen horrors that no man should ever witness, and the thought of being mocked by these women, who had lived through their own version of the war, cut deep. But he had been warned by Captain Mitchell not to engage, not to rise to the provocations. These women were trying to provoke a reaction. They wanted to see if they could shake the American soldiers, make them respond with anger, frustration, or even violence. Despite his irritation, Crawford bit his tongue and kept walking. He had learned long ago to pick his battles. He had fought in the freezing cold of the Ardennes, had watched men die in the snow, and had himself taken shrapnel. He had seen the best and worst of what humanity could offer. And now, here he was, being mocked by women who, despite their own suffering, still clung to the belief that their cause had been just. "They need this," Lieutenant Sarah Morrison had explained to Captain Mitchell one evening as they discussed the growing tensions. They need to believe that they are still superior, that everything they've been told is still true. It's the only way they can cope with their defeat. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the camp. He had fought in North Africa and Normandy, seen both the best and worst of war, and while he had no sympathy for the Nazi cause, he couldn't deny that these women were trapped in a world of their own making. They had been taught to believe in the absolute righteousness of their ideology. Now they were being forced to confront its complete collapse. The verbal harassment grew daily. The women would gather at the fence, calling out insults in heavily accented English. "Is this what defeated the Wehrmacht?" Helga Schneider would ask, her voice dripping with mock disbelief. "These men stumble like cows. No discipline, no honor. This is the army that defeated our soldiers." At first, the American soldiers were irritated, but as the weeks dragged on, the mockery began to eat at them. These were not just ordinary prisoners. They were women who still believed, deep in their hearts, that they had been part of something greater, something more powerful than the American soldiers they now mocked. They were the last bastion of Nazi ideology, and their pride, though broken, was still intact. But the more the women mocked, the more they exposed their vulnerability. Their strength was not in their words, but in their ability to hold on to their illusions. Every insult, every taunt was a desperate plea to retain something that was slipping away from them. They had lost the war, lost their homes, lost their sense of purpose, but they could still believe in their superiority. They could still hold on to the idea that they were part of something that had mattered. And yet, as the mockery continued, cracks began to form in their beliefs. It wasn't just the soldiers' reactions that started to chip away at their certainty. It was the quiet moments of doubt that began to settle in their hearts. "What did we fight for?" Anna Reichert asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like a weight. What did we lose it all for? The realization had started to creep in. They had been taught to believe that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. But now, trapped in a foreign land, under the watchful eyes of the very soldiers they had once believed inferior, they began to wonder if their entire worldview had been a lie. And yet, they clung to their pride. For what else did they have left? May 1945 brought with it an unexpected shift in the air at Camp Rustin. The warmth of the Louisiana spring was now accompanied by an undercurrent of change. The prisoners had been there for weeks, and the early days of mockery and defiance were beginning to evolve into something deeper, something more unsettling. As the German women prisoners continued to confront their American captors, The tension between them grew. What had started as verbal taunts now gave way to more profound moments of reflection. The women were still deeply entrenched in their beliefs, but the world around them, this new reality, was beginning to eat away at their certainties. Margaret Hoffman, ever the proud leader, continued her routine of military discipline, but now her commands seemed to ring hollow. The strict formation of the women, the morning calisthenics, the imposed structure, it was all part of the charade she had constructed to maintain the illusion of German superiority. But every day, it felt less like an assertion of strength and more like a desperate attempt to retain control over a crumbling identity. She could see the cracks in the others, though none dared speak them aloud. Even the sharp-tongued Helga Schneider, once so certain of her place within the Nazi system, had begun to lose some of her former certainty. Her derisive remarks about the American soldiers became less frequent, and when they did come, they seemed to lack the same venom that had once punctuated her words. The quiet doubt was spreading. "Do you ever wonder," Schneider whispered to Hoffman one evening, "if we've been wrong all along?" Hoffman shot her a sharp look, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Schneider wasn't the only one who was beginning to question. Anna Reichert, the once enthusiastic mocker of American soldiers, had started to shift. Her vocal contempt was now tinged with something darker, a growing unease that perhaps the Americans were not the bumbling fools they had once believed them to be. The realization was slow but undeniable. These were not just young recruits stumbling through their exercises. There was something different about them, a kind of resilience, a toughness that had begun to seep through the thin veneer of mockery. They weren't just men who fought with numbers. They fought with something more. And as the German women observed them day after day, they couldn't help but see the contrast. The American soldiers, despite their imperfections, had a strength of spirit that the women could no longer ignore. "They're not what we thought," Reichert admitted, her voice barely audible as she watched a group of American soldiers complete a grueling obstacle course with unexpected grace. "They move differently. There's a kind of coordination, a purpose." But still, Margaret Hoffman held tight to her ideals. To her, this was a temporary setback. The American victory was due to sheer numbers, to the mass production of war materials, to the overwhelming power of the Allies' industrial machine. "We lost because they outproduced us," Hoffman told the women one evening, her voice unwavering. "But that doesn't mean they are better. It only means they had more." Her words fell flat in the silence that followed. Helga Schneider and Anna Reichert exchanged looks, but neither spoke. The defiance in Hoffman's voice could not mask the growing cracks in the facade. Meanwhile, the American soldiers were feeling the pressure of the ongoing mockery. Despite the order from Captain Mitchell not to engage with the women's provocations, the insults were beginning to get under their skin. Every day, as they trained, the jeers from the prisoners seemed to grow more biting, more relentless. The soldiers were aware that these women had been part of the same machine that had brought death and destruction to Europe. They had fought, bled, and lost too much to be mocked by those who had once stood on the other side. Sergeant James Crawford, still nursing the wounds from his time in Bastogne, found himself particularly affected by the women's words. Each taunt felt like a direct assault on everything he had fought for. His jaw tightened as he heard them laugh at his fellow soldiers. He had seen his friends die on the battlefield, and now, here he was, being mocked by those who had once been the architects of the evil he had fought against. Yet, despite the growing frustration, the soldiers remained disciplined. They had been trained to endure much worse, and this was no different. But the sting of being mocked by women who still believed in the superiority of their cause was hard to shake. The growing divide was becoming more than just a psychological battle. It was now a war of wills. The German women were not simply prisoners. They were proud, resilient, and unwilling to accept the collapse of everything they had believed in. And the American soldiers were not just captors. They were warriors, tired but resolute, unwilling to let these women, these symbols of their enemies, hold on to their illusions of superiority any longer. The mockery continued, but now there was something more. It was not just about pride anymore. It was about breaking the spirit of the enemy, about forcing them to confront the truth of their defeat. And while the German women might have believed their ideology was unshakable, the reality of their defeat, of being captured by the very soldiers they had once despised, was beginning to crack their resolve. May 1st, 1945, arrived with the weight of a shifting world. The European war was nearing its end, but for the women prisoners at Camp Rustin, the news of Adolf Hitler's death hit them like a blow to the chest. The announcement was not just the end of a tyrant, it was the collapse of everything they had once believed. Yet, remarkably, this news seemed to only harden their resolve. To them, Hitler's death was another layer of Allied propaganda, another attempt to break their spirit, to convince them that their cause had been in vain. Margaret Hoffmann, more than anyone, refused to accept the reality of what was happening. Her pride, though chipped away by the weeks of captivity, remained steadfast. As news of Hitler's death spread throughout the camp, Hoffmann clung to the belief that the Führer had not taken his own life. "This is nothing more than an American lie," she insisted. "The Führer would never abandon us. This is simply another test of German faith." Despite the overwhelming evidence of Germany's impending collapse, Hoffmann's resolve remained unshaken. She was not the only one clinging to the hope that this was some sort of propaganda trick. Many of the other women held on to the idea that somehow the Third Reich was not truly defeated, that there was still a chance for their beliefs to prevail. Even as the reality of defeat seeped into their surroundings, through the arrival of American soldiers, the destruction of their homeland, and the collapse of their military, they refused to yield. For Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, it was becoming increasingly difficult to watch. Morrison, one of the few female officers at the camp, had been assigned to oversee the interactions between the prisoners and their captors. She had a background in psychology, and it was clear to her that the deeper the women sank into their delusions, the harder it would be for them to accept the truth. She had watched the cracks in their facade grow over the last few weeks, but the shock of Hitler's death brought with it something far more complex: cognitive dissonance. The women had to reconcile the man they had been taught to revere with the reality of his death, the end of their world. Hoffmann's reaction was perhaps the most telling. For weeks, she had maintained a strict discipline over the group, forcing the women to uphold the idea that they were still part of something greater, that they were superior despite their current situation. But as the weeks dragged on, she began to change. The stoic leader was no longer unshakable. Her confidence wavered, her commands less certain, her demeanor colder. She had built a wall around herself, but that wall was beginning to crack. The American victory was no longer just a matter of numbers and material. It was a psychological defeat that no amount of pride could counteract. Captain Robert Mitchell, who had seen war from the North African campaign to the Normandy invasion, watched the transformation with a mix of curiosity and weariness. He knew that these women had been trained to believe in their superiority, that they had been taught from childhood that they were the masters of Europe. But what was becoming increasingly clear was that the greatest battle wasn't over territory or soldiers, it was over the mind. Mitchell had been reluctant to engage with these women, unsure of how to break through their ideology without making the situation worse. But as the days wore on, he knew that action was required. His camp was not just a place for prisoners, it was a training ground for psychological warfare, and the German women had to be shown the truth of their defeat. Mitchell approached Colonel Franklin Whitmore, the camp commandant, with an unorthodox idea. "These women need to see something real," he said, his voice low but firm. "Something that will shatter their delusions of German superiority. They've seen the basic training of young recruits, but they haven't seen the men who fought and bled on the front lines. They haven't seen what American soldiers can do when they're trained to the highest standards." Whitmore, a veteran of both world wars, raised an eyebrow at Mitchell's suggestion. "You want to parade our advanced units in front of these prisoners?" he asked skeptically. "Why? To impress them? We've already won the war." But Mitchell didn't back down. "No, sir. It's not about impressing them. It's about breaking through the lies they've been taught. These women still believe that American soldiers are weak, that we fought through numbers and equipment, but they need to understand that it wasn't the weapons that won the war, It was the strength of the soldiers. It was the will to fight. Lieutenant Morrison also supported the idea, having witnessed the mockery and defiance from the women. They need to see more than just the recruits. They need to see what real soldiers look like. After a moment of hesitation, Whitmore finally nodded. "All right, Captain. But this stays controlled. We don't need any media attention, and we don't need any security issues." The plan was set into motion. Ranger Battalion 4, a highly trained unit preparing for the expected invasion of Japan, would conduct a series of advanced training exercises in full view of the German women. These were the soldiers who had fought in Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. They had seen combat in the most brutal of conditions and had come out stronger for it. The idea was simple: to show the women what real American soldiers were capable of. These soldiers weren't just recruits, they were veterans. And they would demonstrate that the American military was not weak, not undisciplined, and not to be mocked. The German women would see firsthand what true military strength looked like. It wasn't about propaganda, it was about breaking the mental walls that still surrounded their beliefs. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The celebrations among the American soldiers at Camp Rustin were boisterous, full of jubilation as the long, hard-fought battle in Europe finally came to an end. But for the 32 German women prisoners, the news carried with it a bitter irony. It was the final confirmation of everything they had feared, everything they had refused to acknowledge for so long. The Third Reich had been utterly defeated. As the American soldiers celebrated their victory, the German women retreated into their barracks. Margaret Hoffman, ever the stoic leader, still clung to the belief that this was nothing more than Allied propaganda, a final effort to crush their spirits. She gathered the women, as she always did, and attempted to maintain some semblance of order, but the defiance in her eyes had started to fade. The reality of their situation was becoming harder to deny. That afternoon, the women were escorted to an observation area to watch the advanced training exercises being conducted by Ranger Battalion 4. The American soldiers had been informed only that some camp personnel would be watching, but none of them knew that these exercises would be observed by the very women who had once mocked them. For the German women, this would be their first real exposure to the true strength of the American military. The soldiers who had not only fought their way through Europe, but had done so with a commitment and skill that transcended their propaganda-filled perceptions. The observation area was set up on a raised platform behind protective barriers, positioned to provide a clear view of the sprawling training grounds. The women took their seats, their eyes narrow with skepticism. Margaret Hoffman, though deeply conflicted, sat upright, her gaze fixed on the soldiers preparing for the first exercise. The air was thick with tension, and as the first set of Rangers began to emerge from the tree line, the German women exchanged cautious glances. They had never seen soldiers like these before. The silence that descended upon the training grounds was the first thing that struck the women. The Rangers moved with precision, coordinated in their actions, moving as a single unit, each man aware of every other man's position. This was not the clumsy, uncoordinated mess the German women had mocked in the recruits. These men moved like wolves, fluid and fast, speaking only in hand signals, their movements instinctive, sharp and powerful. As they began to navigate the obstacle course, the German women could not help but watch in stunned silence. The 12-foot walls were scaled with ease, the wire obstacles crossed without hesitation, and the rope bridge over a simulated ravine was traversed so swiftly it seemed like second nature. This was not what they had expected. Helga Schneider, once a nurse on the Eastern Front, leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They move differently," she murmured in German, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not stumbling, they're not weak, they're focused." For the first time, a seed of doubt began to take root in her mind. Anna Reichert, who had been one of the most vocal critics of American soldiers, found herself staring in awe. The training wasn't just difficult, it was precise, efficient, and devastatingly effective. "This is not how we were told it was," she muttered, almost to herself. This is real." The combat simulation that followed only reinforced this growing sense of disbelief. The Rangers moved into a mock village, clearing buildings with explosive breaches, coordinated fire, and tactical precision. The German women watched as the soldiers flowed through the simulation with the kind of ease that came only from extensive training and combat experience. "They move like trained soldiers," Helga Schneider whispered, her earlier mockery gone. This is not what we saw in the films. But the revelation that truly shook the women came during the hand-to-hand combat training. The Rangers paired off, demonstrating techniques with such speed and efficiency that the women could barely follow the movements. This was not the theatrical martial arts they had seen in Nazi propaganda films. This was brutal, efficient, functional violence, designed to kill quickly and move on. The German women, who had been raised on the idea that German soldiers fought with honor, could not reconcile what they were witnessing. The Americans weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to survive, to dominate, to eradicate any weakness. There was no glory in their movements, no room for romanticized notions of honor or pride. It was cold, efficient, and relentless. "Our soldiers fought with honor," Hoffman said suddenly, as if needing to defend the idea she had spent years fighting for. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed on. "That's what they taught us. That's what we believed." Lieutenant Morrison, who had been standing nearby, turned to Hoffman. "Your soldiers fought," she said gently. "So did ours. But the question isn't about honor, it's about effectiveness." Her voice carried an air of authority now that Hoffman couldn't ignore. "Your men were good soldiers," Morrison continued. "No one denies that. But were they superior? That's what you've been claiming. Superior. Watch carefully and ask yourself if that claim still seems as certain as it did this morning." The American Rangers continued to demonstrate their skills, each drill more demanding than the last. Demolitions, engineering, field fortifications, all conducted with the same level of precision and purpose. As the exercises continued, the German women found it increasingly difficult to hold on to their illusions. They had mocked the Americans, had dismissed them as inferior, but what they were witnessing now was undeniable. The Americans were not weak, and they were not the undisciplined fools the women had imagined. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Helga Schneider whispered to herself. "What I saw today wasn't what I expected." As the exercises wound down and the women were escorted back to their barracks, there was a heavy silence that clung to the air. The mockery had stopped. The laughter that had once punctuated their days was now absent. For the first time since their arrival, the German women were no longer mocking their captors. Instead, they were left to confront the shattering of their beliefs, the collapse of the worldview they had held for so long. But even as doubt crept in, one thing was certain: the transformation had begun. It would not be immediate, and it would not be easy, but the first cracks in their ideological armor had appeared. The journey ahead would be long, but there was now the possibility of something different. May 15, 1945, marked a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere at Camp Rustin. The German women prisoners, who had arrived months earlier with an unwavering belief in the superiority of the Third Reich, were now faced with something far more powerful than the American soldiers they had mocked for weeks: the undeniable evidence of their own defeat and the unrelenting force of reality. The transformation in the women was slow and painful, but it was happening. The hard edges of their defiance, the sharpness of their contempt for the American soldiers, were beginning to soften, cracked by the reality they had witnessed during the advanced training exercises. But for some, the change was more immediate. Helga Schneider, who had spent years tending to the wounded on the Eastern Front, found herself grappling with an internal battle she hadn't expected. She had been one of the loudest in her mockery of the American soldiers, but the spectacle she had witnessed, the precision, the coordination, the strength, had rattled her. "We've been wrong," she admitted quietly one evening, her voice almost lost in the silence of the barracks. "I thought we were the superior soldiers. I thought we had something that they didn't. But now, I don't know what to think anymore." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since their arrival at Camp Rustin, the other women listened in silence. The mockery had stopped, but so had the defensive bravado. They had been taught to believe that they were invincible, that they were the elite, the chosen ones. But now, doubt had begun to creep in, something they had never allowed themselves to entertain before. Margaret Hoffman, the self-appointed leader of the group, still held on to her ideology. but even she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Her firm belief in German superiority was beginning to waver, though she refused to admit it aloud. She could still see the American soldiers as weak and undisciplined in her mind, but the doubt gnawed at her. Every time she looked at the Rangers performing their exercises, every time she saw their silent coordination and skill, she found it harder and harder to maintain the facade of superiority she had once worn like armor. She still insisted, as she had since the beginning, that their loss had been a result of numbers, not superiority. "We lost because they outproduced us," she told the group one evening. "But that doesn't mean they're better. We fought with honor, with discipline." But the others were starting to question that narrative. Anna Reichert, once the most vocal in her mockery of the American soldiers, now stood silently as the women discussed the training exercises they had witnessed. "They didn't fight like we thought," she murmured to herself. "We were wrong about them. They weren't weak. They weren't undisciplined. They were something else." And that something else was what was beginning to crack their belief in their superiority. The realization that the Americans were not what they had imagined them to be was both unsettling and liberating. For the first time in months, they were able to see the American soldiers not as inferior, but as men who had been forged in the fire of war, men who had experienced hardship and loss, and who had come out the other side not broken, but stronger. Yet the transformation was not universal. Hoffmann still fought against the inevitable. She maintained her military discipline, kept the formations sharp, and continued to believe in the greatness of the German cause. But the reality of their situation was beginning to break through. The mockery had stopped. The women no longer taunted the soldiers or laughed at their exercises. They had seen enough to know that American soldiers were capable of something far greater than they had ever imagined. And this realization planted the seed of self-doubt, of questioning their own beliefs. For the first time, the German women began to understand what had happened to them. They had been defeated not just by the Allied forces, but by the very ideology they had held so dear. "We were lied to," Helga Schneider whispered one night, as she sat in the barracks, the weight of her realization settling heavily on her shoulders. "Everything we believed, it was a lie. It was the beginning of a profound psychological shift, but the discomfort of facing that truth was something none of them had anticipated. To accept that everything they had fought for, everything they had been taught, was built on lies, was an impossible task. It was like trying to tear apart the very fabric of their identities. And it was in this moment of intense internal conflict that Lieutenant Morrison saw the possibility for change. She had studied psychology before the war, and it was clear to her that the women were facing a battle of beliefs, one that had been ingrained in them from childhood, shaped by decades of propaganda. It was not enough to break their pride. They had to be shown the truth. They had to see the reality of what had happened, not just in terms of military defeat, but in terms of the ideology they had been raised to believe. "We need to show them the truth," Morrison said to Captain Mitchell one evening, after observing the growing disillusionment in the women. Not just about the soldiers they fought against, but about what they believed in. They need to see the consequences of their actions. Mitchell nodded. "They've seen the Americans in action, but they still don't believe. They need more. We need to show them what their ideology led to. We need to make them confront the truth of their complicity in the atrocities committed during the war." It was a radical plan, but Mitchell was growing increasingly certain that it was the only way to break through to them. He knew the truth was painful, but it was the only path to real transformation. June 1st, 1945, brought an air of uneasy anticipation to Camp Rustin. The celebrations for victory in Europe had faded, but a different kind of tension was now simmering in the camp. The German women prisoners, once so confident in their beliefs, had begun to experience cracks in their worldview. They were no longer mocking the American soldiers with the same fervor, but the journey of psychological transformation was far from over. Now, Captain Robert Mitchell and Lieutenant Sarah Morrison had devised a new way to confront their prisoners with the truth, an effort not just to break down their ideology, but to shatter it completely. The plan was simple, yet radical, to force the German women to face the consequences of the Nazi regime they had supported, to see the full extent of the atrocities committed in their name. Mitchell's decision was not made lightly. He knew that showing these women graphic evidence of the war crimes their countrymen had committed, could be a dangerous gamble. Psychological trauma was a very real risk, especially since many of these women had worked within the system. But for Mitchell and Morrison, the stakes were higher than mere discipline. The ultimate goal was to show them that their ideology, the very core of their beliefs, had not only been false, but had directly contributed to some of the worst atrocities in history. Lieutenant Morrison had been preparing for this moment for weeks. She had arranged for the War Crimes Investigation Team to bring their materials to the camp. The women would be shown photographs and documentation of the concentration camps, of the murderous brutality of the Nazis. It wasn't just about confronting them with the Holocaust. It was about showing them that their support of the Nazi regime had been complicit in this systematic evil. The women were ushered into a large room within the camp, one that had been converted into a temporary theater. They sat in tense silence, unsure of what was to come. The air was thick with unease as they exchanged glances, trying to brace themselves for whatever was about to unfold. Margaret Hoffman, who had maintained a strong front throughout their captivity, was unusually quiet. Her defiance was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, fear. As the lights dimmed, a projector flickered to life. Hoffman refused to look at the screen, keeping her gaze fixed forward, but the sounds, the haunting images that began to flash across the wall, were impossible to ignore. The first images were the concentration camp photographs. Photos of emaciated bodies, piled high in mass graves, prisoners in ragged clothes, their faces gaunt and empty. The women's faces, once filled with pride and certainty, now showed signs of distress. It was impossible to turn away from the images, though Hoffman tried to do just that. One of the women prisoners, Helga Schneider, had been a nurse on the Eastern Front, and as she saw the photographs of the concentration camps, her face went pale. The camera zoomed in on her expression, and she visibly shook. She recognized the faces in the images, the wounded soldiers, the ones she had treated. But now, she was seeing them in a different light. She saw the victims, the innocent people who had been murdered while she had been complicit in supporting the system that had allowed these atrocities to happen. "I didn't know," Helga Schneider whispered, her voice breaking, as the images of Auschwitz flashed on the screen. "I didn't want to know." Margaret Hoffman, sitting next to her, remained silent, but her lips were trembling. "This is propaganda," she muttered under her breath, but even her voice lacked its usual conviction. The photos were followed by video footage, American soldiers liberating the death camps, Soviet prisoners of war, their bodies bloated and discarded like refuse, the gas chambers where men, women and children had been systematically murdered. The American soldiers' faces were hard to read as they filmed, but the German women couldn't help but see the shocked expressions of the liberators. For them, this was not just a story, it was reality, a reality they had been shielded from for so long. As the footage continued, Anna Reichert's expression began to change. The arrogance that had once been part of her persona, her mockery of American soldiers, her certainty that the German soldiers had fought with honor, was replaced by horror. She had been taught that the war was a fight for survival, for order, for a greater cause. But what she saw now, in these images, was something far more sinister. "They told us it was lies," Anna Reichert said in a choked whisper, her voice filled with disbelief. "They told us it was Allied propaganda." She looked at Hoffman, who refused to meet her gaze. "But this is real." In the darkness, Hoffman squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were seared into her mind. The truth, horrific and undeniable, was right in front of her. But still, a part of her resisted. "We were told this was a war of survival," Hoffman muttered, almost as if trying to convince herself. "We were told they were enemies of civilization. But we didn't know." Lieutenant Morrison, who had been translating the information, stepped forward. "You knew enough," she said gently, her words cutting through the air. "You knew that people were being taken from their homes, that families were being torn apart. You knew that something terrible was happening, even if you didn't know all the details. You were lied to. But you were also part of the lie." The room fell silent, the weight of Morrison's words settling like a thick fog. For the first time, the German women were forced to confront the full extent of the Nazism they had served. They had believed that their actions were justified, that their cause was noble, but now, confronted with the evidence, they had no choice but to question everything they had been taught. June 28, 1945, marked a turning point in the psychological rehabilitation program at Camp Rustin. The atmosphere, thick with conflict and reflection, had already begun to shift. The German women prisoners had been confronted with the unrelenting truth about the Nazi regime's atrocities, but even as they wrestled with the aftermath of their indoctrination, Captain Robert Mitchell knew that a new challenge lay ahead. It was time for them to meet the survivors, the very people who had lived through the horror they had once denied. Mitchell's decision to bring Holocaust survivors into the camp was not made lightly. He had been warned by others that it could backfire, that the emotional tension could spark violent reactions from both the German prisoners and the American soldiers. But Mitchell believed that this was the final, most necessary step in their transformation. These women had spent months facing intellectual and emotional challenges, but they had yet to meet the survivors, the true face of the genocide they had supported. The survivors had been liberated from various Nazi concentration camps, some having spent years suffering in the death camps and others in forced labor. Now, temporarily housed in a displaced persons facility near Camp Rustin, they were invited to meet the women who had once been a part of the machine that had caused so much suffering. The tension in the room was palpable as the German women were lined up, forced to confront the true cost of their beliefs. The meeting took place in a small neutral room, guarded by both American soldiers and the camp's officers. The atmosphere was so heavy it seemed as if even the walls were holding their breath. Margaret Hoffman was seated in the front row, her spine straight but her hands tightly clenched in her lap. Helga Schneider sat next to her, her eyes cast downward as if avoiding the inevitable confrontation. The rest of the women were equally silent, their faces a mixture of anticipation and fear. For the first time, they would have to look the survivors in the eye and confront the reality of what their ideology had wrought. Sarah Rosenberg, a 24-year-old survivor from Ravensbrück, was among the first to speak. She stood tall, despite the fact that she had only recently regained her strength after being liberated from the concentration camp. She had lost her entire family, parents, siblings, aunts and uncles, at the hands of the Nazis. Now she stood before the German women, not out of forgiveness, but to bear witness. "I want you to understand something," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "You say you didn't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe you didn't know the full details of the genocide. But you knew enough. You knew that Jewish families were being taken from their homes. You knew that we were being forced to wear yellow stars, to be treated as less than human. You knew we were disappearing. Maybe you didn't know exactly where or how, but you knew enough to know something terrible was happening, and you chose to look away." The room was silent. The German women sat frozen, their faces pale, as they were forced to confront the truth of what they had been part of. Margaret Hoffman, who had once been so vocal in her defense of the Nazi cause, now appeared stricken. Her eyes darted nervously between Rosenberg and the others, unable to form words in response. Anna Reichert, who had once dismissed the suffering of those labeled undesirable by the Nazi regime, now found herself unable to speak, her face flushed with guilt. The world she had once believed in had been completely shattered by Rosenberg's words, and the reality of the Holocaust was now inescapable. But it was David Levi, a survivor who had lost his wife and children to the Nazi death machine, who spoke next. His voice was sharply bitter, his words laced with anger. "Your sorrow means nothing to my dead children," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the German women before him. "Nothing to my murdered wife. You want to absolve yourselves with apologies, but I can't give that to you. What I can give you is this: you will carry the guilt for the rest of your life." His words struck like a hammer. The German women, some of them still clinging to their belief that the Nazi ideology was just, now realized that they could no longer hide behind their excuses. David Levi was right. Their apologies were hollow, and the horror they had helped create could never be undone. The room was heavy with emotions: anger, grief, guilt, confusion. Hoffman struggled to find her voice, but it was weakened, no longer the confident, commanding tone she had once used. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. "I was taught that we were fighting for something noble. I was taught that we were the good ones." Lieutenant Morrison, who had been silently translating the testimonies, stepped forward. "You were lied to," she said gently but firmly. "You were taught to believe a monstrous lie, and now you have to live with the consequences of that lie. You can't undo what was done, but you can choose what to do now." As Rosenberg and Levi finished speaking, the German women were left to absorb the weight of their words. The truth was undeniable. The ideology they had clung to had fueled one of the most brutal genocides in history. But for the first time, they had been forced to see the human cost of their beliefs, and the confrontation had left them reeling, shattered in ways that no exercise in American military superiority could ever have achieved. July 1st, 1945, arrived with the suffocating heat of summer settling in over Camp Rustin. The celebrations from Victory in Europe Day had long since faded, replaced now by the heavy silence that hung in the air as the German women prisoners grappled with the aftermath of their confrontation with the Holocaust survivors. Their world had been shattered. The propaganda they had lived by, the ideology that had defined them, was now a thing of the past. What remained was the bitter reality of their complicity in the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Over the past few weeks, the women had undergone a transformation, but the process was slow, painful, and uneven. Some of the women had begun to question everything they had believed, while others, like Margaret Hoffman, still clung desperately to the ideals of the Third Reich, even as the foundation of those beliefs crumbled beneath her. For the first time, the German women were forced to look inward, to confront the truth about themselves, their actions, and the regime they had once served so fervently. As the psychological rehabilitation program continued, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison and Captain Robert Mitchell worked tirelessly to help the women process their emotional turmoil. But the burden was heavy, and the personal transformations were varied. Some women, like Helga Schneider, began to show signs of resilience and self-awareness. Others, like Anna Reichert, struggled deeply with the internal conflict of reconciling their former beliefs with the truth they were now confronted with. Helga Schneider, once a proud nurse who had treated wounded German soldiers on the Eastern Front, found herself at the center of this transformation. She had witnessed the worst of the war, but the images of the concentration camps and the testimonies of the survivors had cut through her defenses. In the weeks following the meeting with the survivors, Schneider began to speak openly about her past, about the complicity she had felt, even though she had been a medical professional. She admitted with trembling hands that she had ignored the signs, told herself that the suffering she witnessed was just part of war. "I knew something was wrong," Schneider admitted one evening in a private session with Dr. Abraham Feldman, the Jewish psychiatrist who had been assigned to help the women process their trauma. "But I told myself it was war. War is terrible. I said I treated the wounded, and I told myself that was enough, that I was doing good. But I was treating wounded soldiers who were fighting for that. I was part of it. I never saw it before, but now I do." Dr. Feldman, who had lost family in the Nazi death camps, responded with compassion, understanding the painful awakening Schneider was experiencing. "You're confronting something very difficult, Helga. You're seeing the gap between who you thought you were and who you actually were. You thought you were helping, but now you understand that your actions were part of a system of murder. Both things are true. You're not a monster, but you were also complicit in something monstrous." For Schneider, this acknowledgement was the first step toward healing. It wasn't easy and it wasn't immediate, but she began the difficult journey of reconciling her complicity with her humanity. "I can't change the past," she said quietly, "but I can live differently now. I can speak out. I can tell the truth." But not all the women were as ready to accept the truth. Margaret Hoffman, though she had been forced to confront some of the shocking realities of Nazi ideology, still struggled to let go of her beliefs. "We fought for something greater," she would repeat, her voice becoming more fragile as the days went on. "We fought for honor, for Germany. We fought to save Europe from chaos." But even as she said these words, the cracks in her confidence were becoming more apparent. Anna Reichert, once the most vocal critic of the American soldiers, was in the midst of her own. internal struggle. She had witnessed the American Rangers in action, had seen them in the field, had watched their precision and strength. But what was happening now, this internal conflict, was something deeper. Reichert had been the first to question her beliefs. It was not an easy process, and her psychological breakdown had been just as intense as the physical exhaustion she had once felt in the war. "What do I do now?" she asked Lieutenant Morrison one evening, her voice raw with emotion. "What do I believe? Everything I knew, everything I thought was true, it's all a lie. I don't know who I am anymore." Morrison had no easy answers for her. "What do you want to do?" she asked gently. "What do you want your life to mean now?" For Anna Reichert, this question became the starting point for her transformation. She wanted to matter. She wanted her life to have meaning beyond the lies she had once believed in. But to rebuild her identity, she had to start from scratch. "I want to help rebuild," she said slowly, her voice growing steadier. "I want to help the next generation avoid the mistakes of my own." But it wasn't just the women who were changing. The American soldiers were beginning to see the prisoners in a new light. The mockery that had once defined their interactions with the women had faded. There was recognition now, a shared understanding of humanity. It wasn't friendship, but it was recognition. Sergeant James Crawford, who had been wounded in the Battle of the Bulge, found himself in an unexpected conversation with Helga Schneider one afternoon. She was working in the camp infirmary, tending to sick and injured prisoners under supervision. As they spoke, Crawford noticed her careful attention to the wounded. "Your leg," Schneider remarked, noticing his limp. "Battle of the Bulge?" Crawford nodded. "German artillery shrapnel," he replied. Schneider was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, her voice softer. "I treated German soldiers wounded in that battle. Boys, mostly, 18, 19 years old, terrified, dying." Crawford's heart tightened, the weight of her words cutting deeper than expected. "I hated you then," Schneider added quietly, her voice filled with sorrow. "I thought you were destroying Germany. Now I understand you were trying to stop Germany from destroying everything else." Crawford took a deep breath, the complexity of their shared history settling over him. "Maybe you don't reconcile them," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe you just hold both truths at the same time. Those boys were victims too, victims of a system that sent children to die for an evil cause. You helped them, and that was good, but the cause they died for was evil, and stopping it was necessary. Both things are true." For Helga Schneider, Crawford's words marked the beginning of her own healing. She had begun to see the humanity of her captors, not as enemies but as people who had endured a war of unimaginable destruction, just as she had. This recognition, this mutual understanding, was something she had never imagined possible when she first arrived at Camp Rustin. September 1st, 1945, arrived with a kind of finality that only a war's end could bring. The sounds of the American soldiers celebrating the conclusion of the war in Europe had long since faded, and now, at Camp Rustin, there was a somber quiet. The German women prisoners, who had arrived months ago with contempt and arrogance, had undergone a transformation far deeper than anyone had anticipated. They had been forced to confront their own ideology, their complicity, and the atrocities they had once denied. The repatriation process was beginning, but for these women, the journey they had undertaken at Camp Rustin was just as significant as the war itself. What had begun as a rehabilitation experiment was now a reality. The Nazi beliefs they had held on to so tightly were being replaced with something else, a new understanding of themselves and the world around them. Captain Robert Mitchell stood in the command office, watching as the final preparations for the repatriation unfolded. His thoughts were heavy, weighed down by the complexities of the rehabilitation program he had initiated months earlier. He had seen transformation, but he had also witnessed the psychological toll this process had taken. Some of the German women had embraced the opportunity to change, but others had resisted, still holding on to fragments of the Nazi ideology that had defined their lives. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, now seasoned by her time in charge of the rehabilitation, walked into the room, her expression thoughtful. "We're almost there," she said, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and resolve. "They're leaving, but they're different. It's not perfect. Some of them will carry the weight of their past forever, but many of them have taken the first step towards something better. Mitchell nodded, but his mind lingered on the irony of the situation. They're going back to a Germany they don't recognize, he mused, and they'll carry the guilt of their past with them. They'll face a country shattered by war, by division, and by the ideology they helped build. The German women were now gathered for the final evaluation, a process that had become a quiet form of reckoning. The psychological assessments conducted by Dr. Abraham Feldman, who had worked with the women for months, showed varying degrees of progress. Some of the women had made remarkable strides towards self-awareness, while others still clung to their old beliefs, unable or unwilling to let go of the past. Margaret Hoffman had been one of the most difficult cases. A woman who had once been so certain of her superiority, Hoffman had struggled to reconcile the truth she had been confronted with. But there was a change in her, a faint glimmer of self-awareness, though still clouded by the guilt and shame that weighed heavily on her. She had been the leader, the voice of the women's defiance, but now she stood alone, grappling with the truth of her past. During their final interview, Hoffman had looked at Lieutenant Morrison with a mixture of frustration and regret. "I keep asking myself," she had said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "when should I have known, when should I have realized that everything I believed in was a lie?" Morrison had no answer for her, no simple words of comfort. "You couldn't have known until you were ready to see it, Margaret," she said softly. "But the important thing now is what you do with that knowledge." Hoffman had remained silent, her eyes focused on the floor, as if searching for a way to make sense of it all. For her, the war was not just a military defeat. It was a personal collapse. She had given her life to an ideology that now lay in ruins, and the weight of that realization was crushing. In contrast, Helga Schneider had embraced the process of self-reflection. Helga, who had once believed in the noble cause of the German soldier, had come to understand that she was just as complicit in the war crimes as anyone. She had been a witness, a participant, but never an active perpetrator. Yet, the guilt she carried was just as heavy. "I treated the wounded soldiers," she had said in one of her final sessions with Dr. Feldman. "I helped them fight, but I never questioned why they were fighting. I don't know who I am anymore," she had confessed to Lieutenant Morrison, "but I want to be something better. I want to help rebuild. I want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." These women, Schneider, Reichert, and even Hoffman, had begun the slow process of rebuilding their identities, not based on the pride of a fallen regime, but on a new understanding of what it meant to be human, to live with integrity, and to face the consequences of their actions. But not all the women were as ready to face the truth. 3 women, including one of Hoffman's former deputies, remained largely unchanged. Despite the rehabilitation program, they still clung to the beliefs that had brought them to this point. They had gone through the motions of self-examination, but their hearts remained closed to the truth. They believed that the Holocaust was exaggerated, or that Germany's defeat had been caused by external forces, not by the evil at the heart of the Nazi regime. The final day of repatriation came on September 1st, and the German women were escorted out of the camp. As they boarded the transport trucks, their faces were a mixture of emotion. Some were tearful, others silent, lost in thought. They were leaving Camp Rustin, but they were not leaving the guilt and regret behind. Captain Mitchell watched as the trucks pulled away, taking the women back to a Germany that was now divided and defeated. The future was uncertain for them, as it was for everyone in the wake of the war. But he knew that the process of transformation had begun. Whether the women would continue on that path was up to them. September 1st, 1945, arrived with a bittersweet finality for the German women prisoners at Camp Rustin. The trucks were ready, their engines rumbling as they waited to carry the women away to the next stage of their journey, repatriation to a defeated Germany. These women had been held at the camp for nearly 5 months, a time that had changed them in ways they could hardly understand. As the transport trucks rolled away from Camp Rustin, there was a sense of closure in the air. The women were leaving a place where they had been forced to reckon with their ideology, their past, and the truth they had long avoided. But despite the physical departure, their mental and emotional journey had only just begun. Many of the women would return to a Germany in ruins, its cities leveled, its infrastructure shattered, and its people grappling with the consequences of the Third Reich's actions. The psychological scars of defeat were just as deep as the physical damage to the country. The women who had left Camp Rustin would return to face a nation they had never imagined, a shattered society where the reality of their complicity in Nazi crimes would be impossible to ignore. Among them, Margaret Hoffman's struggle with her transformation was far from over. She had been the most resilient in her defense of the Nazi cause, but as she sat quietly in the transport truck, she was haunted by the questions that had plagued her since the meeting with the Holocaust survivors, the photographs of the death camps, and the increasingly undeniable truth of the war she had fought in. "I thought I was part of something noble," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "I thought we were saving Europe, saving Germany." But now, what was it all for? For Helga Schneider, the path towards self-acceptance was still jagged and uncertain. She had come to terms with her complicity, but the guilt she carried was a heavy burden. "I treated the wounded," she had said to Dr. Feldman, "but I never asked why they were fighting. I never saw the truth. The truth was now undeniable, but the damage she had helped enable could never be undone." Still, she had found a sense of purpose in her healing. She was no longer just a nurse who had served the Nazi cause. She was a woman who had been forced to reckon with her past and who now had the chance to build a new life, one rooted in truth. But for Anna Reichert, the transformation was perhaps the most profound. She had once believed in the Nazi ideology so deeply that she mocked the American soldiers with a vengeance, convinced that German soldiers were the epitome of honor and military superiority. Yet, by the time of her departure from the camp, she had undergone a profound shift. "I want to help rebuild," she had said, a resolve hardening in her voice. "I want my life to mean something different than the lies I was told. I want to make sure this never happens again." Anna had taken the hardest path, the path from blind obedience to self-awareness. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but she was no longer the woman who had arrived at Camp Rustin in March, certain of the righteousness of her cause. Now, she had seen the truth, and she had a mission to build a better future. As the trucks carried the women away, Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Morrison stood silently at the camp's gate, watching the convoy disappear into the distance. It was clear to both of them that Camp Rustin had become more than just a holding area for German prisoners. It had become a place of transformation, a place where ideologies had been shattered and new identities had been forged. But they both knew the journey wasn't over. For these women, and for the world at large, the reconciliation between the past and the future was an ongoing struggle. The repatriation process was just the beginning for these women. They were returning to a country in chaos, a Germany divided and defeated. Some would be greeted with hostility, others with fear and uncertainty. Germany had to rebuild, not just its cities but its soul. And for some of the women, that meant telling the truth about what they had learned, about the ideology they had served, and about the complicity they had carried. "We will carry our guilt," Schneider had said quietly, her voice steady as she looked out the window of the transport truck. "But we won't let it paralyze us. We'll use it to make sure this never happens again." Margaret Hoffman, as the convoy passed through the gates, caught a final glimpse of Camp Rustin in the rearview mirror. Her mind was filled with the faces of the American soldiers, the young men who had defeated her beliefs, who had shown her the strength and resilience of a nation she had once despised. She had spent so long believing that her pride and loyalty to the Reich made her superior. She saw how fragile that belief had been. "I can't undo what I've done," she thought, "but maybe I can help make it right." As the trucks rumbled down the road, the women looked ahead to a future that was both uncertain and full of potential. They had been defeated militarily, but the true battle, the battle for their minds, was just beginning.